Greetings everyone, I'm Adam Haritan, and in this video I'm going to discuss 6 trees that you can easily identify by smell. Now I want to focus on smell in this video because as we approach the dormant season here in the northeastern portion of the United States, we don't have the full suite of features available with which we can use to identify trees. Fortunately, there are many trees that possess unique aromas, and if we learn which trees these are, we'll have a much easier time with our identification process. Now before we begin, there are 4 important points that I want to mention. Number 1, we're mostly just going to be focusing on twigs. So if you take a twig from any of the trees mentioned in this video, and if you scratch the outer bark and get to the inner green cambium layer, that's where you will detect the smell. Because we're in the dormant season, we don't have access to fresh flowers or crushed leaves, both of which can be used as reliable identification features. We're just mostly focusing on twigs in this video. Number 2, the trees featured in this video commonly grow in eastern North America and more specifically in the northeastern portion of the United States. Keep in mind, however, that some of the trees will have broader distributions that grow outside this range, but for the most part, you can find these trees in eastern North America. Number 3, the trees featured in this video do not comprise an exhaustive list of all the trees that contain unique smells and aromas. Clearly, there are more than 6 trees in the northeastern portion of the United States whose twigs smell whenever you scratch them. But for brevity's sake, I'm just going to narrow down the list to 6. And number 4, generally speaking, it is safe to scratch and smell the twigs of woody plants. Safe for the plants and safe for you. Keep in mind, however, that there may be a few woody plants that you probably wouldn't want to scratch. 2 around here include poison ivy and poison sumac, but for the most part, most woody plants are safe whenever you scratch and smell them. So, keeping those 4 important points in mind, let's begin our discussion of 6 trees you can easily identify by smell. The first twig we will look at is this green twig of medium thickness right here. Now remember, you want to scratch the outer bark, get to the inner green cambium layer, and smell that. You can't just put the twig up to your nose unless you're smelling where you broke it off from the tree. But you probably won't get the smell unless you break into it. That's where you'll get the smell. And you want fresh twigs as well. And you can tell they're fresh because whenever you break into it and you see that the cambium is still green, that means the twig is fresh. So don't gather twigs underneath the tree, get the fresh ones. So whenever I scratch this one and smell it, immediately I'm hit with a lemony, a citrusy, a fruity aroma. It's very reminiscent of Fruit Loop cereal. Now, honestly, I haven't had Fruit Loop cereal in decades, but if it smells anything like it did all those years ago, then I would say that this twig smells just like Fruit Loop cereal. So which tree does this green twig belong to? Well, this belongs to a tree called sassafras, and sassafras is a medium-sized deciduous tree in the laurel family that colonizes old fields. It grows in forests, many times as thickets, and it's very common in eastern North America. Now, the twigs of sassafras are easy to identify even without the smell. I already mentioned they're green, and more specifically, the young shoots and twigs of sassafras are green. The twigs are smooth, sometimes faintly fuzzy, and you will occasionally see a whitish bloom on the twigs that rubs off with your fingers. The buds that are found on sassafras twigs are oval, they're yellowish green, and they contain overlapping scales. Now, sassafras is unique in that the whole tree is fragrant, not just the twigs. And perhaps the most well-known fragrant part of sassafras is its root, which, when scratched, smells like root beer. And actually, the oil of sassafras root, known as saffrole, was a main ingredient used in the production of traditional root beer. That is, until the United States Food and Drug Administration banned its use in the early 1960s when it was shown in a few studies to be carcinogenic at extremely high doses to rats. Now, sassafras leaves are also fragrant and are used as a flavoring and thickening agent in gumbo. But because we're currently in the dormant season here, we don't have access to the leaves, and unless you feel like digging, you won't be able to scratch and sniff the roots. Fortunately, we do have immediate access to the twigs of sassafras, and if you scratch the outer portion of the twig and get to the inner green cambium layer, you will quickly smell the fresh, lemony, citrusy, fruit loopy aroma of the sassafras tree. The second twig we will analyze is this very thin twig with very pointed buds right here. So this is sassafras, and you can see how much thicker the sassafras twig is. You can see how much greener it is as well. This one's very, very thin with pointed buds. So let's scratch and sniff this one. Not sassafras, I'm gonna put this one down. And this one right here smells exactly like wintergreen. It's almost like toothpaste. And if I chew on it, it's like I got toothpaste in my mouth now. So this one just is all about wintergreen. Just smells like wintergreen, it tastes like wintergreen. So which tree does this very thin twig belong to? Well, this one belongs to a tree called black birch, or Betula lenta. And black birch is a pioneer species characterized by its somewhat smooth gray to dark gray bark that breaks up into plates as it matures. The twigs of black birch are thin, they're smooth and hairless, and they're reddish brown. The buds on the twigs are sharply pointed and they contain overlapping scales. Now, the twigs of black birch aren't the easiest to positively identify, but if you scratch a twig, you will definitely detect the wintergreen aroma. This aroma is attributed to a compound known as methyl salicylate, which is used in a variety of commercial food products, beverages, toothpastes, mouthwashes, and topical pain medicines. Methyl salicylate was formerly extracted from the bark of black birch trees, but nowadays the compound is manufactured synthetically. Now, some people also refer to this tree as cherry birch because the bark resembles the bark of black cherry, and some people refer to this tree as sweet birch because of its wintergreen smell and taste. Regardless of what you call it, there is no denying that its twigs smell strongly of wintergreen. The third twig we will take a look at is this one right here, a very thin twig, again with pointed buds. This is black birch over here, the one we just discussed. It smelled like wintergreen. This is the new one. They look very similar in appearance, but let's scratch and sniff the new one, see what we come up with. So again, I'm getting wintergreen, and nothing but wintergreen. It's pretty much just as strong as the other one, maybe not as strong, but it's definitely wintergreen and nothing else. Which is odd because this was wintergreen, but this one right here, the new one, is not black birch. This is black birch, this is not black birch. So which twig is this? Well, this is a twig that belongs to a tree known as yellow birch, or Betula Alleghaniensis. And yellow birch is a birch tree with a more northern distribution, and it's associated more with the northern hardwood hemlock forests. And if we take a closer look at the twig, we can see its resemblance to the twig of black birch. The twig of yellow birch is thin, but it's more grayish than brown, and the twigs are slightly hairy. Also, the buds are a bit smaller, and they're a bit more rounded. So they're pointed, but they're not as sharply pointed as the buds of black birch trees. Yellow birch has bark that is yellowish gray, and this bark exfoliates much more readily compared to the bark of black birch. And the common name of yellow birch pertains to this golden color of the bark. Now, it makes sense that yellow birch smells and tastes like wintergreen because yellow birch is taxonomically placed within the same subgenus that black birch belongs to. And all birch trees within this subgenus contain high concentrations of methyl salicylate. The fourth twig that we will analyze is this nice fat one right here. So you can see how big this one is compared to our previous twig, which was yellow birch. Yellow birch, very thin compared to this one right here. So the twig is stout and the buds are also pretty big. So let's scratch and sniff this one, see what we come up with. So this one actually doesn't smell that great. Certainly doesn't smell like wintergreen, doesn't smell lemony. It's kind of disagreeable. It smells almost like skunk cabbage. You know what skunk cabbage is? That plant that inhabits wetland type areas. Or it smells like the spray of a skunk actually. So not that great. So which twig is this? Which tree does this twig belong to? Well, this fat twig belongs to a tree known as Ohio buckeye, or Aesculus glabra. And Ohio buckeye, unlike the other trees that we discussed in this video so far, has a more Midwestern distribution extending down into the lower Great Plains states. And here in Pennsylvania, it only makes its way into the southwest portion of the state. Now, the twig of Ohio buckeye is thick and gray, with thick brown buds with scales that are keeled, meaning these buds have faint longitudinal ridges in the center of the scales. Another key feature of these twigs is that they are oppositely arranged on branches. Ohio buckeye is a medium-sized forest tree that can be found in rich, moist soils of river bottoms and stream banks. And this tree is called a buckeye because the seeds are said to resemble a deer's eye. But because of its slightly disagreeable odor, Ohio buckeye is also called fetid buckeye and stinking buckeye. And in addition to its twig smelling like a skunk, you can also detect this aroma by crushing the fresh green leaves during the active growing season. Now, continuing with twigs that are rather stout in appearance, we've got this one right here for our 5th twig. Look how stout this one is. Even more stout than our Ohio buckeye. So this is Ohio buckeye, the one we just discussed. This one's even bigger. This is pretty common for this tree species. So let's scratch and sniff this one, see what we come up with. Because it's so thick, it's actually kind of hard to get in there. So this is another twig that doesn't smell that great. It's not that bad, but it's not that great either. Kind of smells like burnt peanut butter or burnt popcorn, like a mix between the two. I don't think it's that bad, but it's certainly not as good as the wintergreen of birch trees. It's not as good as the lemony fragrance of sassafras. Yeah, like peanut butter or burnt popcorn, something like that. So which tree does this twig belong to? Well, this twig belongs to a tree by the name of Tree of Heaven, or Ailanthus altissima. When we take a look at the twig, we can see how thick it is. This fat twig is brown and mostly smooth, though it's slightly fuzzy, and the twig contains large leaf scars, signifying that this tree also contains very large leaves. The buds on this twig are relatively small, they're rounded, and they're slightly hairy. Now, it's no surprise that in addition to Tree of Heaven, this tree is also called stink tree because of the funky odor produced both by the twigs and the crushed green leaves. Tree of Heaven, unlike all the trees so far discussed in this video, is native to Eastern Asia, and it was brought to North America, and specifically first to Pennsylvania in the late 1700s. And it is an aggressive tree. It spreads rapidly and is very common in disturbed areas, especially in urban habitats. But the Tree of Heaven also finds its way into disturbed woods, especially along the edges of these woods. So if you think you are in the presence of the Tree of Heaven, give it the scratch and sniff test. See if you can detect this burnt peanut butter or burnt popcorn smell. And for the 6th twig that we will analyze in this video, we've got this very, very thin one right here. It's greenish, it's got rounded buds, very, very thin, especially when you compare it to this very, very thick one right here, which is our Tree of Heaven. So look at the two side by side. You can see it's brownish, you can see how thick it is, you can see it's greenish, you can see how thin this one is. Now, gotta be honest with you, this one actually doesn't really belong to a tree, so I hope you'll forgive me. This one actually belongs to a woody shrub. So it's a shrub, it's kind of like a tree, maybe a small tree, but it's multi-stem. So I guess technically this one belongs to a shrub. I'm going to include it in this video because it is very, very fragrant. So when we break into it, very, very lemony, almost chemically lemony. It's kind of like sassafras, but it's more harsh than sassafras. It's very, very sharp. It's almost like pine sol cleaner. To me, it smells exactly like pine sol cleaner. So which twig is this? Which shrub does this green lemony twig belong to? This belongs to a shrub known as spicebush or Lindera benzoin, and it makes sense that this one kind of smells like sassafras or kind of lemony. They both have these green twigs because both plants are in the same family, which is the laurel family. Now, the twigs of spicebush are very thin, they're grayish green, and they contain 2 kinds of winter buds. You can easily see the rounded flower buds, but you will also see small brown and somewhat pointed leaf buds. And spicebush is one of the first woody plants to bloom in the spring, so you will see its yellow flowers before the leaves even appear, which is usually late March in Pennsylvania. And in the fall, spicebush is easily identified by its red fruits that are present on the female plants. But of course, all year round, you can crush a twig or a leaf and smell the strong lemony fragrance that belongs to spicebush. So there we have it, 6 trees you can easily identify by smell. I guess technically speaking, 5 trees and 1 shrub, so altogether 6 woody plants you can easily identify by smell. Here they are next to each other so you can see them. We've got sassafras, we've got black birch, we've got yellow birch, we've got Ohio buckeye, we've got Tree of Heaven right here, this thick one, and the very thin one on the end is spicebush. Now you can make teas out of some of these twigs as well, like sassafras you can make a nice tea out of, make a nice tea out of birch, and also a nice tea out of spicebush. And not only do you get the aroma of it, but you get the taste that you're also smelling. So I encourage you to explore your woods, see which trees smell, because clearly there are definitely more than just 6 trees in eastern North America whose twigs smell when scratched, and I encourage you to figure out which ones those are. Thanks so much for watching this video. I truly appreciate it. If you'd like to support this channel, you could subscribe to the YouTube channel. You could also head on over to learnyourland.com and sign up for the email newsletter. And if you are on social media, you can give Learn Your Land a follow on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.